Today we have Adenike Oyeola, Nike, Practice Manager for Public Financial Management, Public Procurement Reforms in the Global Unit of the World Bank to chair this webinar. Can I hand over to Nike to conduct the proceedings, please? Nike.
Thank you very much, Srini. Let me also join you to say good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody participating in this great event today. Like Srini said, my name is Nike Oyeola, and I work with the World Bank. And I would like to welcome every one of you to this very important meeting. And I ask myself, why is this meeting important? Many of us would know that currently, starting from last Sunday, November 6th, the United Nations Climate Change Conference, which we all know as COP27 now, is taking place in Egypt. And we have a lot of countries, development partners converging to discuss climate. So the question for you and I today is, and perhaps for everybody around the globe, the question is, can public investment policies integrate climate change and livelihood? And I just want us to start thinking along this line, even as this important meeting continues. So today we'll be reviewing the examples of what we called insights from South Asia. I know there are insights from different regions of in the globe, but today we want to take a specific look at South Asia. So, and specifically, we'll be looking at the research that was done in that part of the world. This global webinar has been organized by the PEFA Secretariat of the Governance Global Practice of the World Bank. As you may know, the Secretariat is 21 years now. Last year, we had a very good all year long celebration of the 20th anniversary of the Secretariat. The PEFA framework has become a gold standard when it comes to discussion, assessment, learning in aspects of public financial management. You may want to know that over these 20 years, we've carried out 751 assessments in 157 countries, and we still continue to count. And this cuts across low income, middle income, high income countries. So you'll agree with me that this gathering is very important for the subject matter, for public financial management, for public investment management, and very importantly, for the global good that concerns you and I, climate. So the objective of this webinar today is to present the findings from a research paper, one of the research papers that we've done in the PEFA Secretariat. And those specific ones looks at integrating climate change and livelihood within public investment policies. And like I said, we're looking at a cross-country assessment in South Asia. And so this is a collaboration between the PEFA Secretariat and the University of Essex. And I'll be introducing the people who will help us through this today. Before I introduce, I want all colleagues to know that, as usual, we want a very interactive session. We would like participants to, be very active on the chat, put in your comments, put in your questions, and we'll try to address as many as we can. I would also want to emphasize the fact that, like so many of our learning sessions, this is very important for every one of us to learn and to, take it forward even as we do our work. So I would like to welcome today some of the people that will be speaking to us. I have Dr. Radha Wagel, Director General of Department of Plant Resources from the Ministry of Forests and Environment in Nepal. Dr. Wagli, you're welcome. I also have Mr. Novil Wijesekara, please pardon me, founder of the Community Resilience Center, medical doctor and Asia Foundation Development Fellow in Sri Lanka. Thirdly, I have Dr. Nimala Padmanabhan, Associate Professor, St. Teresa's College, Kerala in India. And fourthly, I have Dr. Bedanand Upadhyaya, Dr. Chaminda Wijetilak, Professor Pawan Adhikari, Professor Kelom Jayasingbe, and Professor Arun, who are the winners of the PEFA research competition from Essex Business School and who produced this research report. I would like to welcome every one of you to this discussion, and I really hope we're going to have a very nice discussion today. But just before we go very far, I would like to invite Mariana. Mariana is one of our development, is with one of our development partner agencies, the Slovak Republic, from their Ministry of Finance. These are one of the partners of the PEFA agenda and helping to move the PEFA agenda forward. Mariana will be delivering an opening remarks. Mariana, over to you.
Thank you very much, Nike. Dear partners, representatives of the government, PFM researchers, practitioners, dear colleagues, on behalf of the PEFA partners and the Ministry of Finance of the Slovak Republic, I would like to welcome you all to the webinar. Slovakia's partnership with PEFA set off a couple of years ago based on the mutual recognition of the truly key role that the public financial management plays in the development of a country. And we have known PEFA as an important tool to assess the state of PFM, provide a snapshot of the PFM system in a particular time, and inform countries' national reform efforts. But it has evolved to be much more than that. PEFA program is also a rich source of data, PFM knowledge and experience, with the potential of becoming a sort of a knowledge hub for community of PFM experts, academics, practitioners, and interested public contributing to the global discussion on PFM. This is why we very much appreciate that PEFA has lately focused more on research activities, on issues that can be instrumental for governments, PFM policy and operational discussions. And in our experience, personal and institutional capacity and the knowledge exchange is the key to success of any reforms. The public finance landscape has been evolving, and due to global challenges, multiple crises and financing gaps, nowadays it is inevitable for governments to make these issues part of the fiscal policies. As far as the climate change is concerned, the urgency and the complexity of this issue requires not only implementation of the climate-related fiscal reforms, but as the study pinpoints, also the personal capability to integrate climate change priorities into public financing and policy documents. And this is where PEFA is very relevant. Firstly, through its newly established climate framework, PEFA helps the governments to understand their strengths and weaknesses in integrating climate change into PFM systems. And secondly, through pursuing activities that broaden the knowledge base and exchange among the PFM community and the public by supporting research on the climate action implementation and, of course, other PFM issues. So in line with this, today's session on integrating climate change and livelihood with public investment policies and management is built on the research report, as was mentioned by Nike, and it is published under the PEFA research competition. So we will be focusing on exploring the intersection of PFM and climate change. I'd like to mention that the report is available in the public domain. And in the end, let me give a warm welcome to the speakers, and thanks to the PEFA Secretariat for organizing this interesting and a very relevant event. I wish you an engaging time and interesting discussions. And let me pass the floor over to Nike, who will be at the steering wheel of today's session. Thanks. We can't hear you, Nike.
Apologies. Thank you very much, Mariana. I mean, very much on point. I mean, like I said, this is one of the researches we've done, and the expectation is we'll continue to involve and evolve so that we show relevance in the place of global goods and support people on how to move forward. So without much ado, I would like us to just go straight to the presentation. So, I'll be calling on Dr. Chaminda and Dr. Bedanand to give us a key message from the research paper. I'm emphasizing key message because I would like us to have a robust discussion and get input from colleagues as well. So I just want us to focus on the key messages, and then we can move ahead. I think we'll have just about 15 minutes or thereabouts for your presentation. So over to you, Dr. Chaminda and Dr. Bedanand.
Thank you. Thank you, Nike. So can I ask if you can hear me? In the meantime, I'm going to share my slides.
Yes, we can hear you.
And also you can see my screen, right?
Yes, we can see the screen.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Good morning, everyone, and good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are from. So welcome. My name is Bedanand Upadhyay, and I'm going to present the first part of the report, and then my colleague, Dr. Chaminda Bijatilake, will take over. And I would like to thank our colleagues who contributed in this report, with Dr. Professor Pawan Adhikari, Professor Kelam Jayasinghe, and Professor Thankam Arun. And first of all, before we start presentation, I also want to thank PEFA Secretariat and PEFA team for providing us this opportunity to conduct this timely research that I will say, and also funding our research project. So the topic of our research is integrating climate change and livelihood within public investment policies. And this is, as earlier speakers mentioned, about cross-country assessment in South Asia. So some of you may be thinking, why South Asia? So we'll tell you why South Asia is an interesting context. And also we believe the research findings of this study will be applicable to other developing and emerging countries as well. So I will start with this picture. Many of you may be thinking whether this is recent Pakistan flood. No, it's not, because flooding and other climate change related catastrophes are not once occurring events. So this happened to one of our research study, I will say case study area in Nepal. This is related to a 2008 Kosi flood, which not only affected thousands of people and their livelihoods, but also this flood killed many people, around 700 people in the neighboring country, India, Bihar state, and displaced millions of people. So our research aims to look at the impact of climate change, but you may be thinking why there are so many things going on this topic. Now we are aware of this COP27. Last year we had COP26 in Glasgow in UK, but our focus in this study is a bit different. So I'll tell you more about that. But before that, some of you may be thinking, why this study? So I will try to relate the importance and relevance of our study in the recent changing global environment. So there are a lot of reports which highlight the importance of climate change. Of course, we all know there are many other crises like health crisis, economic crisis, But scientists suggest those kind of problems can be solved. But we are not sure if climate change related disaster or issues or impact or consequences can be solved if urgent actions are not taken on time. So there are IPCC report released in 2021. They also released recently in 2022 in April, I suppose. And there is another report we are referring to, which is 2020 Oxfam report. And we can also relate the impact of climate change in the recent events like Pakistan floods, where more than, I will say, 1,700 people died. And the flood displaced millions of people. And the World Bank estimates the total damage around 14 or 15 billion US dollar. Similar pattern you can see what happened in Nigeria, which killed almost 600 people, wildfire in Europe, Florida, we may be aware of this Hurricane Ian. So all these sort of things highlight the impact of the climate change, right? And I would like to refer to this IPCC report, which they published this year. So they highlight the urgent action of the countries or the governments in terms of doing something to address the impact of climate change, because otherwise it's already started threatening the health and livelihood of people around the world and ecosystem health and the biodiversity. But since last COP 2026, the recent report, recently published, I suppose, last week or week before, which is called UN's Emission Gas Report 2022, many of you may be aware of. So it shows the progress since COP 2026 appears highly inadequate, which is sharp in contrast to the appeal that IPCC report 2022 suggests about the urgent action that many governments or many countries they need to take. So that's why, and also there is another report recently published, I think this week before this COP 2027, which shows the cost required by the developing countries to address the impact of climate change in the next 10 years, which seems massive, 1 trillion. So we are not here to talk about the loss and damage and how much money we need to fix all those sort of things, because we all may be aware of this sort of thing, and Paris Agreement, all these sort of COP agreements, and also we also briefly touch into Sustainable Development Goals, number 13, which set up the target for tackling climate change. But here our focus is a bit different. As I mentioned earlier, we are trying to look at the financial perspective, right? What governments can do from their side to address the impact of climate change in terms of using their public finance, public investment in an effective way. So we are referring to this PEFA climate change related framework, which is called Climate Responsive Public Finance Management Framework, which they developed in 2020. And I think this framework is very timely and suitable to assess the extent of the PFM system of many countries around the world, whether it supports the achievement of climate change adaptation and mitigation strategies that many countries' government they have proposed in their nationally determined contribution, which they submit to this UNFCCC. So based on all these things, you may be thinking, yeah, we all know about this sort of thing. So what's the point of this study? So we are trying to highlight these two research objectives that our study looked at. We explored the extent of which public investment policies and climate change related challenges were prioritized by South Asian governments. In particular, we looked at India, Nepal, and Sri Lanka. And we also looked at the livelihood strategy, because the impact of climate change, not only it happened to society or individual, but also it impacts business and it impacts livelihood. So our focus was on livelihood. So what sort of priorities government have, and especially we looked at the budgets. In the method part, I will tell you more about what sort of document we have looked at and how we have collected data to answer these two research objectives. So our case study context, I will say, we looked at Kerala state in India. We looked at Kosi River zone, which is related to province 1 and 2 of Nepal, and we looked at western province of Sri Lanka. So these are two research objectives that our study proposed, and I think PEFA liked our objectives, and they decided to fund our project. And we have completed our study, and we also published this study, which, as earlier speakers mentioned, we can find in PEFA website. So the question is, why South Asia? Because many developed countries, they have this sort of studies conducted in terms of the impact of climate change, in terms of this public finance management systems role, what sort of role PFM plays in terms of using public money and public investment. But very few studies have looked at South Asian context, or I will say developing country context, and research shows developing countries are more vulnerable to this sort of impact of climate change. And other point is South Asia is a home to nearly a quarter of world's population. So very big population, I will say. And also a lot of these sort of climate-related disasters we have noticed in that region. One example is recent Pakistan flood, and many other cases of droughts, cyclones, flood, and landslides that have been happening, and it has been frequent in South Asia in the recent years. So 3 different countries. So India, you can see Kerala is seen as a climate change hotspot. So one study which we refer, and all of the references are provided in the comment box. So Lay et al., they say Kerala can be seen as a climate change hotspot, and which is severely flood affected. So our guest speaker will be able to highlight more about the context of this case study area. And also, we have selected Nepal and Sri Lanka based on their climate vulnerabilities situation. So now, briefly about method, we have collected data in 2 different stages. Like first stage, content analysis. We have looked at a lot of government data set. We have looked at NDC documents, budget speech, and economic surveys. And we have also conducted field study, like where we have contacted our stakeholders, especially government officials, politicians, policymakers, and local experts and consultants. We have also interviewed local residents of flood-affected area of all these 3 countries. In total, we have 64 interviews, 20 in India, 20 in Nepal, and 24 in Sri Lanka. So we have got first-hand insight from the policymakers, from the flood victim, from the NGO officials, from the local representatives, and that's why we will say our data is so rich, which we believe you will find it interesting, and also these sort of findings and recommendations, which my colleague will present very soon, can be applicable to many other developing countries around the world, because they are the most vulnerable to the impact of climate change. So in Nepal, we have found a lot of policies, but these are some of the brief summary of our key findings, where we can see like all 3 countries have very clear national climate change related priorities. They have NDC documents to UNFCCC, and main focus you can see on renewable energy, sustainable agriculture, transport, waste, water, and disaster management. But some sort of gap we have noticed implementation in the grassroots level. So that is one of the key points that we want to highlight in this presentation, which my colleague will elaborate in detail in his presentation. And also one key message that we think can be a takeaway message from this presentation or this seminar is many of us may be thinking about the availability of funds. That's the main issue. But our study highlights it's not only availability of funds, but also its capability building. That can be seen as one of the equally important issue. So not only funding is the issue, but also capability. So in strengthening capability can be seen as one of the key takeaway messages from this study, I would say. So in terms of Nepal, they have a lot of climate change related plan, policies, strategies. I couldn't include all here, but what we have noticed, most of these plans and policies still are not implemented in that extent in the ground level. So that can be seen as one of the challenges. And also in terms of spending, which is increasing since last couple of years, but still it's not, climate change is not seen as a priority by the local governments because they may have many other competing priorities related to infrastructure development or poverty eradication or many others. So this is the one point, but we have our guest speaker from Nepal, so who will be able to shed light on this sort of thing, I suppose. And Nepal is doing well in terms of forestry sector, but other area needs, I think, more focus. That's the finding of our study. And also we highlight the public sector investment in many climate change related areas. So public-private partnership, which we suppose, which believe can be helpful to government to achieve NDC target and also achieve their sustainable development goals. So thank you so much, everyone, for your time and attention. So I'll hand over to my colleague to carry on the findings and recommendation. Thank you.
Thank you, Vidyanand. Yeah, in terms of, I'll continue with the findings from India and Sri Lanka. Actually, we kind of observe similar pattern between among all these three countries. So one of the major observation is that we find a kind of, I mean, it was fascinating to note that all these three countries, they have their own well-documented national level policies. But what is missing is how they disseminate these national level policies to local government and state government authorities. So that is one of the major key observations that we have reported in our study. Another thing is that in terms of investment policies, public investment policies, there's a misalignment between although the government have climate change priorities, climate investment priorities in line with NDCs, but aligning these priorities with the livelihood strategies has been a problem in all these three countries. And because of that, we find when the governments are going to introduce some new policies, new projects, there's a huge public resistance, for example, because these government priorities are not aligned with the ground level public, the community priorities. So in this case, in several cases, for example, in Sri Lanka, when the government wanted to establish new waste management plan, so the villages, the communities are resisting because it is not the priority for the community. So likewise, although the government, the national level policies are well documented, how they are transmitting, how they are passing down to the national level, it has been a kind of a recurring issue in all these three countries. Can you go with that? Yeah. So, and other key findings, for example, there's a limited knowledge in the local government authorities, and also the national budget. Actually, there's a issue of passing, I mean, disseminating this the national budget to the local government authorities. For example, in Kerala, I mean, in India, actually, they should have national action plans, and all the state, they should have a state action plan for climate change. In addition to that, they should have local action plans for climate change. But when we talk to our partners, our interview participants, what we understood was that the state government and the local government authorities, they do their priorities, but which is quite misaligned from the national level priority. So that has been kind of a key issue that in terms of recording and identifying the extent to which these governments have completed, I mean, the accomplished NDC targets. So the other thing is that in terms of recording and reporting, there's no proper recording and reporting mechanisms. So the governments are not aware of the extent to which they have achieved this NDC target. In recent NDC reviews, if, for example, in Sri Lankan government, they could not clearly identify how many targets they have achieved, because there's no central or local government authorities maintaining this kind of a continuous performance evaluation system. With the next. Yeah, in terms of to address these issues that we have observed in our report, we recommend that governments should take immediate actions to at least to make an alignment between the national level policies and the state level policies and the local government authorities, without which it may be quite difficult for us to understand the level of achievement of NDC targets. And also, we know that in all these three countries, agriculture is one of the key priorities, but we see that some governments actually they deviate from these key priority areas. So I think that as a recommendation from our report, that all these three countries need to prioritize the key areas actually, such as agriculture. And also there are some issues regarding the financial commitment. As we know, in all these three countries, they have severe financial difficulties to meet recurrent expenditures, for example. So in these cases, government find very difficult to allocate money for climate change, but they should have national policy or investment policy to allocate annual budget specific. Actually, in the Nepal case, Nepal has been allocating this funding regularly, but in Sri Lanka and India, we could not find that kind of pattern. Yes, Petan, last. Yeah, in terms of, there are many other recommendations, but some of the key finding is that we find, for example, as I mentioned, there's no performance evaluations, monitoring and reporting proper mechanism. So there should have a well-established and that a system that links the local government to national and state level, there should have that mechanism. And one of the other key areas is that we see that all these three countries are inviting public sector, private sector partners to cooperate with the climate project. In this case, we see there's a huge potential for public-private partnership to initiate this new climate change and climate investment priorities. And in addition to that, we propose that climate change priorities should be included in our higher education curriculums. At the moment, there are some projects, but these need to be well formulated in order to take the best out of these climate investment priorities. So these are some of the key priorities, and given that we have limited time, so we can perhaps go for the discussion. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much, Dr. Chaminda and Dr. Vedanand. You know, I was very reluctant to stop you because I realized these were very important issues you were coming up with. And some things just jumped at me. You talked about a gap between national and subnational level implementation. There were concerns, I mean, on the general challenges on implementation and prioritization. I mean, what is coming up very strongly, and I mean, what we've also had discussion at a global level is the need for private sector investment to be able to move this climate agenda forward. And of course, you were talking about limited budgetary support from countries. For some countries, they still don't get the point on how important this is. So, I mean, these are all issues I would like the discussants to reflect on. I'd first like to start with Dr. Rada. Dr. Rada, and I know you have a very good Nepal experience. So reflecting on your experience in Nepal, what would you say should be the priority for government authorities to implement effective and inclusive climate change related policies at the local level, at the subnational level, because this is one of the things that is coming up. So over to you, Dr. Rada.
Thank you so much, respected chair, fellow panelists and participants. Good afternoon, good morning, or wherever you are. And I would like to start from some background information in the beginning, and then I will conclude with your questions. And we all are aware that from the presentation and from other information, Nepal is among the most climate vulnerable countries despite of its negligible emissions. Therefore, while we talk about integrating climate change and livelihood, that is all about adaptation. That is integration of climate adaptation in water, agriculture, biodiversity, natural resources, infrastructure, and etc. In Nepal formally started adaptation action after formulation of National Adaptation Plan of Action back in 2010. That is called NAPA 2010. And we are renowned for locally led adaptation in our region. I think we need to upscale our locally led adaptation in this context because that is working well, but the scale of locally led adaptation is not that much bigger extent to address the increasing threat of climate issues. And our NAPMA has identified several short-term adaptation options in various sectors, and that document acknowledged the differential impact of climate change based on gender and socio-economic condition of the people in our country's context. And by then, Nepal also developed framework for local level adaptation plan to mainstream the climate change at local level. And the locally led adaptation plan of various scales such as village, community forest user groups, community water user group, community agricultural group level, and they have formulated and implemented various adaptation plan by the group themselves or somewhere from the government. And after promulgation of our new constitution in 2015 and after the Paris Agreement ratification in 2016, and Nepal formally entered into a federal structure, and the new climate policies and revised local level adaptation framework has been placed in action. And after the Paris Agreement, we have also submitted our first nationally determined contribution in 2016, and after that we have also submitted our second nationally determined contribution in 2020. I think the previous presenter also mentioned about that. And that NDC become one of the role model NDC in terms of inclusion as well as achieving the 1.5 degree Paris target. And our NDC has both mitigation and adaptation target, and that has mentioned that all 753 local level government will have their own local level adaptation plan implemented by 2030. And similarly, Nepal formulated its national adaptation plan in 2021, and it is also aligned with our NDC. And it has also identified 64 adaptation project, and which has some medium term and long term adaptation actions. And we also have the gender and climate change strategy and action plan, which was formulated in 2021, and it is intended for 10 years. And as our earlier speaker mentioned, there is huge lacking in implementation aspects. And local level government and provincial level government are also formulating their climate policies and trying to integrate that in their periodic and annual planning and programming, but which is a bit slow in progress. In this context, that I am happy to say that we have some inclusive climate policies to integrate climate change adaptation as well as mitigation in sectoral approach. However, the sectoral integration and localization is a bit challenging for us, and I think that is due to lack of awareness, capacity, which includes human resources, institutional capacities, finance, technology, and also the climate data. We need to localize the climate action, because we need minute climate data to have the specific action in local level to address the livelihood of local community. And I think we still need to aware and convince the developer and politicians about the alarming situation of climate and environmental issues and act accordingly and implement the current national climate policies. And the less budget from the internal public financing is utilized in response of climate change. So when we have fiscal budget coding system for climate change, and till date only 5% budget is climate responsive, and rest of the budget is either climate neutral or that is not directly related to climate. And that is why we need to increase the climate responsive budget to address the issue of climate change. And currently we are more focused on sectoral integration of climate change into planning and implementation, and also localization of climate action through integrating local level adaptation plan into periodic plan and annual planning. But this is in slow progress, and we qualified our local adaptation plan as a disaster and gender responsive local level adaptation plan, but it is very hard to achieve. And while we talk about inclusion and leave no one behind, I think that is also a principle of UNFCCC and Paris Agreement, and which is that is highly confined in policy level, however seriously lacking in the implementation. And from database, from program planning to implementation, research, and so forth. And in overall, we are nearly there in policy instrument, but far away to reach for the effective implementation. Therefore, I have some recommendations. Firstly, we need to prioritize the localization of climate intervention, considering the vulnerability of the people. For example, the poor, climate vulnerable communities, including women, indigenous peoples, youth, children, and people with disabilities while planning. And because the climate extreme events, disasters, and other adverse impacts are affecting their life and livelihood more frequently and severely than the other population of the country. And secondly, the effective implementation of current policy that needs resources, better management of public resources, welcoming environment for private investors in climate change portfolio, and accessing the international finance. And lastly, we need to consider the climate poverty and inequality together while dealing with the climate change, because all of them are reinforcing each other. And finally, we need to promote our indigenous local adaptation measures through technical and other supports. And that's it from my side for the time being. I think I took a bit much time. My apology for that. Thank you so much.
So thanks very much, Dr. Wagu. These are very important points. Interestingly, I didn't remember to tell you I wanted you to do 5 minutes, but I think you kept within that time, but came up with very vital points, very vital points. You talked a lot about the adaptation, the need to localize climate data. I like that. I mean, we need to localize it, convince decision makers and even citizens themselves. We still have people that doubt the fact that this is an issue, but also increasing budget and looking at the gender responsive local adaptation plan. All very vital, and very many thanks for that. So, Mr. Noville, Wijesekara, I want you to look, I want us to think of the perspective of livelihood, and from your Sri Lanka experience, how could we ensure that public investments in climate change related projects are aligned with local livelihood strategies? Mr. Noville, your perspectives in 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So we are very clear now. Livelihood and the climate policies, and especially public investment policies, are very closely connected. And I would like to look at this specifically from public health investments in the health sector, because health is so important, as we have seen from the COVID-19 pandemic. Livelihoods of communities are so much closely linked with health, and health cannot be achieved without public investment, especially in countries like ours. So currently we are going through the financial crisis, and I feel that the COVID-19 pandemic as well as the economic crisis are just trailers of the horror movie that the climate change would one day bring. So these are like trials for our governments and communities to see how we could sustain our livelihood through adequate public financing in relation to climate change. So Sri Lanka, as you all know, are very vulnerable to adverse weather events, either through floods, landslides, or droughts, and these events would increase with increased climate risk. So, health facilities, hospitals, as well as preventive health institutions, they can save lives and try to sustain the livelihoods of communities. So, these are lifeline institutions and they cannot get damaged, uh, whatever the calamities that the climate change would bring. However, if we are not prepared adequately, and if these structures and the functional and non structural aspects of hospitals are not resilient, then the communities would face major drawbacks and challenges. So, one example of uh, initiatives that Sri Lanka is taking, partly to prepare for disasters, partly as a measure to be ready for climate induced disasters and extreme weather events, is the Safe Hospitals Initiative. In this initiative, we try to look at our hospitals, preventive health institutions, and we try to see how we could make them more resilient. Resilient from the structural, that means the building and the weight bearing structures, and the non structural elements, that means the lifelines, medical gases, and other inputs into the hospital, as well as the functional aspects, that means the preparedness planning, response planning at hospital levels. So through these, we can make our hospitals safe. And now we are trying to see how we could make our hospital green also, how we could make sure that the hospital is setting an example for being climate neutral, and maybe to set an example for the community to anticipate and adapt climate friendly policies. So we are moving from safe hospitals to green hospitals to smart hospitals. In the meantime, it is important that the preparedness, the message of preparedness, which is so important when it comes to extreme weather events, boils down to the community level, the local hospital. Every small hospital is prepared. So we are trying to have hospital preparedness planning every year with the support of government funding. So the government invests, even despite the crisis, on continuing investing in hospital preparedness, because that is so important. It's important becomes more during crises such as climate change and the economic crisis or COVID-19 pandemic. So let me try to finalize my points from looking at health system building blocks. So a resilient health systems has to look at 6 building blocks, and these building blocks are so important when it comes to stressors and shocks such as climate change, COVID-19, and the economic crisis that we are currently uh, experiencing. So leadership and governance is so important, and our leaders should look at climate change as a realistic and important issue. And as previous speakers mentioned, we have everything so nice on paper, and how can we make this paper document into reality? So for that, we need leadership and governance, both from within and outside the climate change and health sectors. Secondly, the service delivery, that is so critical when it comes to health, especially livelihood is so much dependent on healthy communities. So service delivery must be sustained. Then health systems should also have adequate financing. Day by day, we understand how much it is important to maintain the health sector financing to ensure the safety and well-being of most vulnerable communities. Finally, we need to think about health workforce capacity building, especially make them more comfortable working with, even with least or minimal resources, we have to do that. And also medical products and technology is so important, and how do we finance them? For example, vaccines. How could we ensure that these commodities are equitably distributed? In the meantime, when the services and supplies are available, how ready are communities to accept those technologies? And then health information system should be resilient. We have to look into the climate aspects of our health information system. Are we capturing the information about the effects of climate change on human health? Is our health system sensitive to that? And what are we doing to accept those challenges and work on them? So here are some thoughts, and would like to discuss more in next session if possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Nuville. I really wish we had more time to drill into all these very important subjects. I mean, we've talked about leadership, service delivery, the health systems financing, but also about the capacity building, the capacity development. These are all very important. And I think this just nicely links to what I would like to ask Dr. Nimala. Dr. Nimala, again, I know you have, amongst so many other global experience, let's look at what you're doing in India. So the challenge right now is there's limited resources and there are changing global contexts. Just like the last speaker said, health crisis, economic crisis. So my question then is, how can developing or emerging economies like India be able to prioritize, finance, and implement effective climate change policies in order to achieve the NDC targets, but also to meet the local needs? So over to you, Dr. Nimala.
Thank you. Now, regarding the question that you asked, I think India is relatively slightly better because we have a positive growth even during this bad economic crisis times. And actually, if you look at the Indian context of financing climate action, you will find we have mostly, varied sources of funds that we have depended on. One is the budgetary resources that the government has put in. The other is the internal and external budgetary resources. For instance, we have the Indian Renewable Energy Development Agency, which channelizes equity investment into energy projects, solar projects, and other sources. We have the private sources like the CSR funding, as well as we have the government policy itself is encouraging private investment in the form of production-linked incentives to industries. So the policies are also, trying to encourage private investment in climate action. And lastly, we also have not only the central government policies and resources, but also the local, state and the local government resources. So now coming to India's context, as Prime Minister Modi has emphasized in COP27, we really believe in life or life, that is the lifestyle for environment, or the grassroots, that climate action starts at the grassroots and the individual level. And that is where Kerala's context has been analyzed, becomes very important, because Kerala has a very strong decentralized system of climate action. We have the local action plan for climate change. And I would like to highlight some examples where they have used the local funds, the local government funds for climate action. And in that context, there is some of you may be aware that Kerala is very famous for decentralization, and we have the state agency, autonomous agency, the Kerala Institute of Local Administration, which supports local governments. And since the past few years, they have a training to the local elected representatives on climate action for climate change. And they have been hand-holding local governments to use their resources for climate action. And the one positive point is, I don't know whether it's a positive or negative point, because Kerala has been facing disasters and climate change one after the other. It's not just the 2018 floods. Last month, we in Cochin had a cloud burst, which gave us, 1 month's rain in 5 hours. And that led to massive flooding of the cities. And it is happening very, very frequently. And we have a so all these frequent cloudbursts, storms, landslides, every year we are having floods, which was unheard of in my young days. All these have brought climate action to the forefront, to public discourse, and made people aware of taking mitigation actions. And here I would like to highlight but a few problems also. That is, one is, as I said, the capacity. Though the autonomous institution assisted local governments in developing climate action plans using a certain percentage of their own resources, unfortunately, only a few local bodies have done that, because many of them lack the capacity to visualize climate change mitigation in the entire perspective. The disasters have also brought a negative impact, that people perceive climate change action as disaster management rather than overall comprehensive, change for climate action. So these are some of the points we would like highlighted. That is, one is the capacity of many of these local governments to draft effective plans for climate action is rather limited. Second is the monitoring system is not exactly great to measure the impact of whatever the strategies we are taking. And third is, I have hardly found livelihood used with climate change in the positive sense. Mostly what we talk about are how climate disasters affect livelihood negatively and how it reduces livelihood. I think we should also start focus on thinking how, positive climate action can also lead to green jobs and the circularity aspects, and those kind of things also need attention. These are some of the factors that Kerala we really need to address, and to get over this, rather confined concept of perceiving climate action as equivalent to disaster management.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Nimala. Again, like I emphasized previously, this is a very important discussion, and it's so hard to actually ask anyone to stop. Quite a lot to say when we're talking about this, but I really got some very pertinent things from what you said. That even though, I mean, there could be funding in some of the local governments or in some of the work, there still needs to find some strong ways to bring this climate action to the forefront and take very clear mitigating actions to address all the things that are coming up now. I'd like us to have a very good discussion, but just before we go into that, like I said, the PEFA team have done quite a lot in this perspective. So I would like two of the senior governance specialists in PEFA to give their perspectives from the work they're doing on PEFA, but also from their general perspectives. So let me first go to Tia, and right after Tia, I'll ask Richard to jump in. Richard and Tia are both senior governance specialists with the PEFA Secretariat. Colleagues, if you can just keep it at 3 minutes each. I'm really running over my time. Tia, over to you.
Thank you so much, Nike, and thank you, everybody. Really fascinating discussion and hear all your perspectives. So I'll say just a few words about PEFA perspective in light of this discussion, in light of this report. And particularly, I'm thinking about the core work we do. As you know, we have a PEFA assessment framework that looks at the strengths and weaknesses of PFM systems. We have a new supplementary framework on gender. And as we mentioned, we're also now piloting a climate responsive PFM framework. So what we are trying to do is that while we produce and commission this research, to look at the broader new thinking about BFM and how do our frameworks fit into that, and how we can make sure that they reflect the absolute best practice there is at the time. So 3 points for me. One is a rather basic point, and it is about the importance of good BFM systems around the budget cycle. We heard quite a bit about from the research, but also from the discussion about the importance of allocating adequate but targeted resourcing for climate finance, and then making sure that that spending is adequately monitored. We have robust data about it, including locally. We make that report available to the public, etc., as well as coordinating that across the nation. And we in PEFA, we've always taken an approach that is very important to have all these elements in a meaningful way across the budget cycle to make sure that BFM systems really work for delivery. In the PEFA Climate, similarly, what we do is that we start from the policy. We have a questionnaire to ask us about what are the priorities for climate in that country. Then we ask and look at whether those priorities are in the budget, how they monitor it, and how they also externally scrutinize, for example, with parliaments. But what we do know that there's challenges in integrating all these elements in the public financial system. And it's just, this report just highlights how important those basic things are, although they might sound simple and obvious, but we know that they're often still not. So I think that was the main point that I wanted to make. The second point is really about the importance of the local level. Well, we heard from the research team, and I think it's quite powerful to say, even if you have national policies and even you may have financing, there is a gap about implementation at the local level. And we in the BFM community have woken up to the fact that we need to move our focus from ministries of finance to line ministries, but also to the local level. And also looking at not only what happens at the local level, do they have enough resources and capacity to really implement climate finance, but also how do we look at the intersection between central and local governments, and how does that work at the national level? We in PEFA actually now about 42% of all PEFAs are done at the local level. And in May, we published a specific guidance to local governments how to use PEFA. And in that framework and in that guidance too, we look at questions that came out from the research. For example, how reliable is the central level government financing to local governments? How adequate it is, how transparent it is, how reliable it is. But importantly, do we also ask in the budget systems, how does the spending relate to local priorities? Are we engaging with the citizens about what they need and what their needs are? So I think that's really important. But also I wanted to add here a comment that I heard from Dr. Radha, which was very interesting. We also see that more and more PEFA frameworks on climate and on gender are used together. And I very much heard about the need to integrate inclusiveness and equity also in these discussions. And I do think that's something that is a big thing for us as a PFM community to think about. How do we bring the equality and climate aspects together in a way that's actually pragmatic for our clients in countries to do with many other priorities and capacity needs? But certainly, this is something that we're also thinking in the PEFA, and how we can make sure that we can integrate those aspects in a meaningful way. And the final point, which I don't say much, I think Richard might be adding on this, is about public investment management. We heard how important that is for climate change. We also look at that in the PEFA climate framework. We have a specific indicator that looks at how countries' public investment management integrates climate considerations. What are the laws and regulations? How is it effective in project prioritization, appraisal, and monitoring? But the unfortunate thing is that what we know so far from the pilots that have done PEFA climate is that what we see is that practice around the world is not yet sufficient. So there's big improvements there that are needed. This is not surprising in the sense that we also know from PEFA data that public investment management overall is one of the weakest PFM areas. So that perhaps suggests that we need to work on the public investment management systems before we can meaningfully integrate climate in those. So I'll leave it there and pass on to Richard to continue on this. Thank you so much.
Thanks for leaving it there, Tia. Gabi, a very important point again. Would really love to hear from discussant from others as well. But Richard, if you can keep it to 3 minutes, please. Let's get your perspectives and then we can address some questions that are coming up and also hear from some members of the research group. Very quickly, Richard.
Thank you so much, Nike. Again, let me start by saying a big thank you to the presenters for this very stimulating discussions. I've had the privilege of co-managing PEFA's research competition with Tia for the past 2 years now. And over this time, I've come to basically accept that supporting studies like this are absolutely critical for addressing the significant gaps in our current understanding of why certain PFM trends prevail, even though there are, to some extent, genuine efforts to change these trends. Take, for example, the trends that we've highlighted in the 2022 Global Report on PFM. The report shows, as Tia mentioned, widespread weaknesses in countries' basic capacity to manage capital investments. There are many issues and administrative bottlenecks. For example, as of December last year, the report shows that none that have done a PEFA assessment using the 2016 framework have achieved the highest possible PEFA score for monitoring public assets. In fact, more than 80% of the countries that we looked at still struggle to estimate the total life cycle costs of significant investments. And more than that, even the year-by-year breakdown of investment costs are typically omitted from budget documents. So these weaknesses raise many questions, some of which the researchers attempted to answer. But one pertinent question is how can governments really credibly commit to addressing climate change when basic systems, such as the payment system, are not even functional? Looking ahead, with billions expected to be spent in investments that mitigate or adapt to climate risks, the thing is, we can't simply assume that this will translate into outcomes. We heard from the presenters, the evidence suggests that weak capabilities are more concerning than the availability of funds. And as they said, this makes capacity building a top priority. So it would really be a stretch to think that we can address climate change without simultaneously addressing the weak PFM environment in many countries. So against this background and from a PEFA perspective, I would say this research and others like it play a crucial role in really providing the empirical support that we need to advocate for strong PFM reforms and good PFM in general and robust payments specifically. And this is necessary for achieving progress towards helping governments to make more credible climate commitments. So, considering the ongoing discussions at COP27, I just want to thank again the Essex team for undertaking this timely and very relevant study. We're looking forward to the continued collaboration. Over to you. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Richard. Thanks very much, Tia. And just to emphasize the fact that the PEFA Secretariat will continue to progress on looking at how public financial management, can promote or can be promoted through all the public goods that has become very important, and that climate being one of it. So colleagues, I would still want to encourage you to put your questions or your comments in the chat if you have any. I have a few questions of mine, but just before we go to that, like we said, and like the presenters acknowledged, the research team is actually larger than two. There were some other people that participated in the research. So I have Professor Pawan Adhikari, I have Professor Arun, I have Professor Kellogg also participating in this meeting today. So if any of you have some very quick perspectives, 1 to 2 minutes of contributions, please just unmute and contribute before we go to any further discussion. Please go ahead, Professor Arun.
Thank you. Thank you. I think it's a it's a great opportunity. And first of all, let us thank again PEFA for this wonderful opportunity for us to work on this topic. But what is emerged out of this is, like in any other policy fulcrum, the real issue, the real nut and bolt actually rests with how to implement these policies at the ground level. And regarding the climate change, the biggest task is, particularly in South Asia, is because of its large number of poor, the poor population. I think it's a livelihood is uh, very much linked with the climate change. We know the political arguments from South Asia in COP26 and is reflected again in COP27 so far. So it's quite clear that the political argument is very much related to the livelihood options there. And here, what we noted is in all the three countries, we have seen the governments per se are very positive and forthcoming about the targets and proposing the targets and trying some plans for those targets. But in terms of implementation, maybe because of its size, it may take larger than anticipated time. For instance, in the case of India, it's not 2050, it's going to be 2070. But at the same time, if you look into the per capita emitter, we see that India is actually much lower compared to many other countries there. So there's a broader geopolitical argument trust there, and that's there. But how we can address this is more than the policies. I would consider it's more with the practices. When we talk about practices, the practices needs to start from the bottom level. So that's one of the findings of this study, is about a bottom-up approach in this one. And also, this is very much related to the remittances and migrant situation, because all these three countries have large number of people who live in other parts of the world. So just imagine a situation. If somebody asks for a climate-related or a pro-green project in my village, I may be the first person to volunteer to support it, rather than providing resources to a larger project. So when we talk about financing or the private financing of these kind of projects, we should not neglect the role of these migrants and their cooperation, their possible collaborative space at the local level. And that is very important for them to participate there. So I think governments, local and national governments, need to explore that kind of a space where the migrant population can actually contribute to this debate. I think that's very important there. And my second point is about education. And Kerala, as Nirmala said, it's slightly well-educated state in terms of 100% literacy and all. But still, many of the local governments are not ready to accept many, or they don't have the capacity to implement some of these things, because there are many issues moving around us. So look at the case of other parts of India or other countries in that sense. The situation is much more serious. So I think it's a massive, there is a space for a massive educative program for the climate change among the large set of population is very important, because that will influence the habits and livelihood approaches, and that will have an impact there. So my point is, even the small efforts are very important in our debate compared to the larger, bigger announcements. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead, Climate.
Please go on. I see Professor Pawan and Professor Kellum also wants to make some perspectives.
I just probably add on Arun, Professor Arun, because of course I like you mentioned, of course I'm
promoted you.
Yeah, because I'm seeing from more accounting perspective. Let's say, for instance, I can share my experience in Nepal, and I went to Nepal. Most of the data coming from budget. So when we ask about the accounting, and there's no accounting as such. So probably the most important thing is when you talk about PFM, it's very much focused on budget cycle and then the reporting based on those budget. but the accounting is missing. And when you talk about climate accounting, it's very interdisciplinary. It's engineering there. So it's a very complex issue. So I think we should focus more on climate accounting to get the appropriate or adequate data. And second thing is, when we talk about climate resilience, I think we should go beyond. I think maybe from the climate accountability, the main issue is why the policies or reforms haven't been implemented as intended. And then we need to probably go on accountability. So when you talk about accountability, we talk about the grassroots level education, we talk about competency development, we talk about how is embedding local voices in development process. So all this climate auditing. So I think probably the next thing is we may need to look from wider perspective. This how to promote climate accountability, and that may embed many important things that have hindered the implementation of effective policy that many Central South Asian government has how is issued. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Pawan. And if I add this is I think we are overlapping with our ideas in many sense, but I try to add a little bit more into this conversation. And I mean, when we are looking at this, the findings that we have in our study and the other studies I did again for the PEFA in relation to different subject areas, one thing common coming up is that we have to address this micro level issues. I mean, the micro level political economic issues, institutional and political economic issues, because what happened is the PEFA framework or any other framework, they are really excellent, and but then the issues are coming not at the national level. When they are taking it to the micro and the local levels, even in India, all these regions and the provinces are very different to each other. We talk about Kerala, talk about Mumbai, Delhi, and then go to Karnataka or some other rural regions, and then the issues are very different. And that's number one thing. We need to address these contextual differences and then the implementation related issues in relation to the specific localities if you want to be successful in the implementation level. And that's number one. And then the number two is that when you are talking about the climate change and climate change actions, and then people are more concerned about the basic poverty and the basic issues of hunger, food and shelter and all these things. How come we talk about the climate actions with these poor people in Karnataka or some other region in India and in Sri Lanka, some of the rural villages? So we have to understand the realities at the micro level if you want to be successful. It's nothing wrong with the PEFA programs or the models. These are fantastic. I mean, I fully appreciate that. But when it comes to the implementation, these local realities are very different. We must appreciate that, understand that. We can't just ignore it because we don't want to, we don't like it. We have to accept this fact. And then if you want to be successful at any means, that's something. And then going beyond this political economy argument, if you look at this Sri Lanka, country like Sri Lanka, there's one bigger issue in the institutional what you call power and the authorities, and we have the constitutional issue in Sri Lanka that there is a provincial governments are managing some local issues. There's a national government has another link to the locals. So there's an administrative kind of a problem in the Sri Lankan context when it comes to the local level decision making. So these things are not very general in each and every country, but India, very good, very nice delegation is there for the local governments, but Sri Lanka is exactly the opposite. So I think these things, they again come into that institutional level analysis, the local realities in terms of administration, in terms of the local people's needs, and then the local institutional power and the authority to address these things, and their knowledge on this climate actions over the poverty issues. These things are very diverse, very dynamic and diverse, and strangely unique in some localities. So understanding them is the only way to move forward. That is my personal view. This is based on my other research as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And even from our own development perspectives, we've increasingly realized that taking the development to the grassroots, which you call the local level, is very important if you really want to make significant impact. So I can't agree with you anyways. So there's an interesting question which is coming from the head of the PEFA Secretariat himself, and like anybody, either the researchers or the country counterparts to reflect on these. So anyone who wants to make an input, And I think the last speaker, Professor Kellon, spoke a bit on the political economy. But the question is, how does the political economy of climate change and public investments management work in practice? What's the practical, apart from the theory? Who are normally the champions and who are the people that are usually against it? And I mean, I usually start from many times ago when people thought there's nothing like climate change. I mean, you know, some countries, some countries will even say we're struggling with food, we're struggling with other big pictures than climate change. But increasingly, many people have now realized that this is a big deal that we all need to address. So talk about the political economy, talk about who are the big promoters and who are the people that are really against this. Anybody wants to give this a try? I actually see Dr. Nimala really smiling. So maybe you want to say something about that. And then after Dr. Nimala, maybe Professor Aaron.
I think basically, see, I can speak from Kerala's, from my local context. The people who really don't know, see, there are two categories of individuals, you know, the local elected representatives who are the actual decision makers and the public, you know. So the elected representatives are only interested in winning elections and coming back to power and taking decisions. They are the ones who actually design the budget of the local governments and what strategies and local climate action projects that can be implemented. But unfortunately, what happens, as I said, is they only are interested, they have a very short-term vision, and they are only interested in taking up projects which directly touch the people or the political economy. As they were saying, is they want to get back into election, get elected again. So they only take up projects which literally people feel and touch. That is the disasters. Okay, so it affects them. You know, you make roads, you make lights, you make things like that which directly touch. But what they don't understand is that, so that point we really need to emphasize is that climate action affects each and every one, their livelihood, their food, that kind of knowledge doesn't get communicated to the public as such. So only if the people are, made aware of how that affects their lives, their livelihood, their food, their children. Because I, as a parent, are only bothered about my children, my future, my food, that is the thinking capacity of majority of the individuals. So I think we should connect that to how that affects them. And only if the public is sensitized on those public aspects will the elected representatives, who are the key decision makers, they are the ones who just don't, I think they are the ones who completely ignore climate action, projects for climate action in that, because it doesn't affect their, it is not in their political agenda or their micro level this. So that is through the people. We need awareness to the public. We also need, through them we have to influence elected representatives, and on the other hand we also need extensive capacity building to enable, once these elected representatives get mentally ready to visualize, they need strong capacity building to design projects. I think that should be the strategy at the local level.
Thanks, Dr. Nimala. I told you, colleagues, this is a very passionate topic for every one of us, and it's really hard to stop. Professor Aaron, very quickly.
Yes, yeah. I think as a continuation of what Nirmala said, climate change is always someone else's problem, not our problem. And it is from the top to bottom. This is the thought I think we have been taught. I think that is there. But the main component, as Pranab Bardhan, the professor of political economy at the University of Berkeley, who said that the groups are very important in any political discourse. And here we need to develop some kind of a group who are actually positive about the climate change. And countries like India has great scope in that one, because half of India's population, 1 billion people, half of 1 billion people are under the age of 25. And the country has one of the largest youth populations in the world, and 2/3 of the population are under the age of 35. So it is very important to teach them at very young, from the schools and colleges, in terms of curriculum. And we were having some discussions yesterday, and we realized that even in a Western Hemisphere, we don't have many climate-related modules for their learning at the undergraduate level or postgraduate level, and for the schools also. I think it's very important to caught them at a very young age, and then learn the intricacies of the climate change. I think that is what is lacking at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You know, I really like the way you started. It's somebody else's problem. It's not my problem. But increasingly, we're realizing that it's everybody's concern, and we need to take this very seriously. Richard, I don't know, did I miss out on any question that came to your attention? Richard? Okay. So otherwise, I would like to say this has been a very important discussion today, and I think it's been, well, it's learning for me as well. So very great knowledge sharing. So at this point, I'd like to pass the baton to the head of the PEFA Secretariat, Srini Gurazada, for his remarks, for his closing remarks. I sign off at this point. Thanks very much, everybody.
Thank you very much, Nikkei. And I wouldn't hazard the risk of trying to summarize this super rich conversation in this webinar. The big takeaways from my side is that it is a reinforcement of the fact that climate change is such a complex and a super important area. And we are very glad that we picked it as a theme for the PEFA research competition, and we have these insights into it. Also acknowledging the typical issue we also see in general PFM implementation. Also, the policy aspect putting together is easier. The implementation is not as easy as it in actual practice. That comes up strongly on this, and this conversation informs our PEFA climate pilot framework. It's still, just to mention, PEFA climate is in pilot. We intend to fine tune it and fit it in a way that serves the requirements of the world going forward. So this fits in so well into that, and glad to further hear from all of you. I'll also use a minute for little promotions on PEFA. The first promotion is we have a global report on public financial management already on PEFA website. Audience may like to take a look, those who have not. And we are in next 1 month, you will see also versions in French and Spanish. So you may like to promote to your friends who may not be comfortable with English, but more comfortable with French and Spanish. We also would have a kind of a similar webinar on green public procurement, building on another research publication from the PEFA research competition very soon in the next couple of months. We would also be releasing a global stock take of PFM tools on all the boutique of offerings of PFM tools world has, not just the PEFA Secretariat. That would come out soon, and we'll have events around that. And the final promotion is we have, for those of you who have not already done, we have a e-learning of PEFA PFM. PEFA is probably the best way to go through the entire PFM cycle. You can finish it in 3 to 4 hours. A lot of people are taking. We also launched a campaign to increase the number of women taking this course. Please promote this. This is a free course. You can register and do it at your convenience. Thank you very much, everyone. It has been a wonderful webinar. Thanks to all the speakers, discussants, and the audience joining us. And thank you very much, Nikkei.
Thank you, PEFA, for organizing
Thank
this.
you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, and we look forward to everyone's participation in our next event. Thank you very much. Bye. And thanks to the PEFA team for always working very hard to make all these wonderful things happen. Thank you so much, colleagues.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.